They forced me to stand outside in snow without coats. Then my bodyguard arrived. What if everything you thought you knew about yourself came crashing down in one single, humiliating moment? Hey, my name is Laylat, wasn't supposed to happen. I never imagined it would happen to me. Not in front of everyone, not in a moment, so utterly dehumanizing. It's funny how the worst things in life always seem to hit us when we're least prepared. When we think we've built enough armor to withstand anything. I was standing outside in the snow, shivering, my breath visible, in the freezing air, with no coat to shield me from the biting cold. I had just been kicked out of the warm, safe space that was supposed to be my sanctuary. The party, the lavish event I had attended with my colleagues, turned into a nightmare. I had thought I was fitting in, making small talk, laughing at the right moments, being seen for once. But I was wrong. I had just asked for a moment, a simple thing. I was feeling dizzy and overwhelmed by the noise, the flashing lights, the clinking of champagne glasses. I needed to step out for just a minute to catch my breath. But what happened next still feels like a bad dream. They saw me leave, the people I had worked so hard to impress. The ones who had been smiling at me, exchanging pleasantries. And then they forced me out. Told me I didn't belong, that I was out of place. My boss, someone I had trusted, respected, even turned to me with cold eyes and told me to go outside and get some fresh air, even as the snow began to fall heavily around us. He didn't even offer me a coat, he just pointed to the door. And I walked out. The door slammed shut behind me, and I stood there, surrounded by the cold. The laughter from inside muffled by the walls between us. I felt my whole body go numb, not from the temperature, but from the betrayal. I had been nothing but loyal, a dutiful employee. Yet, in that moment, I was nothing more than a disposable object, easily discarded when the attention shifted elsewhere. I was humiliated, small, invisible, but even more than that, I was shaken. The shame that I felt in those few minutes outside that party was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the cold that made me shiver, it was the weight of being made to feel like I didn't matter. I wasn't one of them. I was just a tool, a pawn, to be used when it suited them. The thing is, I've never been good at standing up for myself. I've always been quiet, reserved, never one to rock the boat. But in that moment, I realized something. I had a choice. I could either let this moment break me, let it define me, or I could fight back. I could make a decision to change everything. Standing there in the snow, feeling the ice penetrate my skin, I made a vow to myself. I wouldn't let this define me. I would take control. But as I stood there, in the dark cold of the night, a voice in my head kept asking, how? Would I just let it slide? Would I accept the way they had treated me? Or would I find the courage to finally stop being the victim? Would I take back control of my own story? I didn't know how I would do it yet, but something told me that this was just the beginning. This humiliation wasn't the end, it was the catalyst. The start of something I couldn't yet fully understand. It wasn't the first time I'd been humiliated, not by a long shot. The truth is, betrayal had always been lurking in the shadows of my life, wearing different faces, hiding behind polite smiles or courteous nods. But this, the way it happened at the party, was the final straw. The moment I could no longer deny what had been building up over the years. I was always the last one to be picked, the one who stayed behind, the one who made the sacrifices. I had grown used to it, but I had never truly seen it until that night. As I walked away from that event, shivering in the cold, my heart was a heavy weight. And I started to reflect on everything I had endured over the years. The small things that I had pushed down, the times I had been overlooked, dismissed, or belittled. I had always told myself that these were just small bumps in the road, things I could get over. But they weren't small anymore. They had piled up, layer upon layer, creating a wall that now stood between me and who I thought I could be. My childhood had been a different kind of battle. Growing up in a house where love was scarce and survival was the priority, I learned early on that being seen wasn't a luxury I could afford. My mother, a hardworking woman with dreams that never materialized, worked 2 jobs. She taught me strength, resilience, but she also taught me silence. When she was too tired to talk, or when she was in one of her moods, she wouldn't speak to me for days. I learned not to ask for attention, not to expect kindness. Self-sufficiency was drilled into me, and I became a quiet shadow in my own home, afraid to ask for anything more than what was given. I remember the small, quiet moments of abandonment, the times when I would make dinner for myself at the age of 10, because she was too tired to cook. I remember sitting in the living room, hoping for just 5 minutes of connection, of warmth, But she was always too tired. Always too overwhelmed. She couldn't give me more than what she already did. The betrayal I felt at that party was familiar, felt like a deeper echo of the same thing I'd experienced in my home. Except this time, I had a job. I had success. I had tried to fit in, to prove that I could be worthy of respect. But the truth was, I didn't belong. Not then, not ever. I didn't know it then, but my whole life, I had been searching for validation from people who would never see me as more than a worker. A tool, someone to make their lives easier. I had learned to be quiet, to accept my place, but deep inside, I always yearned for more. The day I was forced out in the snow was the day I realized I had to face that reality head-on. It wasn't just about the party or my colleagues. It was about how I had spent my entire life letting other people define my worth. I had been standing in the shadows for so long, it was all I had known. But I could no longer keep hiding. I needed to confront these buried emotions, the hurt, the shame, the anger that had been festering for years. I had always tried to push them away, to bury them, but I couldn't anymore. I had spent so much time making everyone else feel comfortable, making sure they were happy, that I had lost sight of who I was. I had become a placeholder in my own life, a silent, invisible force, always reacting, never acting. It wasn't just the betrayal by my boss or colleagues. It was the accumulation of years of feeling unseen, unimportant, even in my own family. My mother's indifference had been one of the most painful betrayals I had ever faced. And though I'd told myself it was behind me, it lingered in the corners of my mind. Her silence was a weight I had never put down. And now, the things I hadn't addressed were catching up to me, as I walked away from that night in the snow. A strange sense of determination began to build inside of me. I couldn't keep ignoring these feelings anymore. I couldn't continue to be the person who let others walk all over me just because. I was too afraid to face the truth of my own emotions. But it was hard to admit. How could I have been so blind? How could I have let myself be a footnote in my own life for so long? I still didn't know exactly how I would change things, but one thing was clear. I had to take control. I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to make it right, to make me feel important. The time had come for me to stop living for others, and start living for myself. The days following the snowstorm were a blur. I was so consumed with the rush of emotions, anger, shame, and a surprising sense of clarity that I couldn't focus on anything else. The freezing wind from that night seemed to have blown through my entire life, stripping away the illusions I had built up around myself. For the first time in ages, I saw the truth. It was raw, uncomfortable, and terrifying, but it was truth. I had been silent for too long, passive in my own suffering. Now, I had a choice to make: stay in the shadows, or take control and rewrite the narrative of my life. I had been avoiding this moment for years. Every time I had a fleeting thought about standing up for myself, I pushed it aside, telling myself it wasn't worth the trouble. I was used to silence, to fading into the background, to doing what others wanted because it felt easier than fighting. But the humiliation at the party, the betrayal from my colleagues, the memory of being cast aside in my own family, they had all piled up, and now, I couldn't ignore them anymore. I had been silent long enough. I started with small decisions. The first was simple. I walked into work the next day and refused to accept the apologetic smiles from the others. They all tried to tell me how sorry they were for the way I had been treated the night before, how they didn't mean for me to be left out, but I wasn't listening. They didn't get it. They never got it. I smiled politely, and then made a choice I never would have dared before. I spoke up. "I don't need your apologies," I said, my voice clear, louder than I had ever allowed it to be. "I need you to understand that I deserve to be treated with respect. And if that doesn't happen, I'll make sure my work speaks for itself, not my silence." The air in the room shifted. For a moment, I felt exposed, vulnerable, but as I saw their expressions shift from surprise to guilt, a new feeling began to rise in me. Power. I had found it in the simplest of words I'd been too afraid to speak. I had just set a boundary, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of control. That afternoon, I went home and sat in my small apartment, staring out at the city skyline that I had always longed to be a part of. I realized something: it wasn't just them. It was me. I had been the one standing in my own way. For so long, I had allowed myself to be a passive observer in my own life. I had been waiting for someone else to see me, to recognize my worth. But no one else could see me until I saw myself first. It wasn't just about the party or my colleagues. It was about how I had allowed everyone, including myself, to disregard my value. I had let others treat me like I was invisible because I had let myself believe that I was. The truth hit me like a lightning bolt. If I wanted to be seen, to be respected, to finally feel like I mattered, I had to stop hiding. I had to stop being a spectator and become the author of my own story. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and opened the closet. There, in the corner, was the coat that I had bought for myself a few years ago, the one I had saved up for months to afford. I had never worn it, always too afraid to stand out, to be noticed, but today, I put it on. I stared at myself in the mirror. No longer the quiet girl who had always faded into the background. The person in the mirror was different, more confident. I walked out of my apartment, determined to make a change. To no longer let my past define me. The days after I made my decision felt like an awakening. Everything seemed sharper, clearer. Every part of me that had been buried, that had been quietly suffocating under the weight of my silence, began to emerge. But with that power came a deeper realization. I could no longer walk the fine line between silence and standing up for myself. There was no going back now. I had to plan, and it had to be strategic. For weeks I had let myself suffer quietly, taking every insult, every slight, every act of disrespect in stride. I had convinced myself that it was easier to let it slide, to pretend it didn't hurt, to just be the good girl who was always willing to forgive and forget. But the truth was that every time I swallowed my pride, every time I stayed quiet in the face of disrespect, I was betraying myself. I was losing parts of who I was. Parts that I would never get back unless I took action. I sat in the quiet of my apartment, letting the weight of my thoughts sink in. The decisions I made now would define me. I didn't have the luxury of playing nice anymore. I needed to take control, not just of my life, but of my story. But how? My thoughts turned to the humiliation I had faced in front of my family, the way they had all turned away, ignoring the sting of my hurt as if it didn't matter. I had spent years pretending I didn't care about the neglect, about how easily they treated me as though I were invisible, dispensable. But that night had broken something inside me. I couldn't just let it slide. I needed them to feel what I had felt. Not out of bitterness, but because I wanted to be seen, to be heard. I thought about my mother, the one person who had always told me to be strong. She had suffered in silence, enduring the same treatment, but unlike her. I wasn't going to tolerate being treated like a shadow in my own life. I wasn't going to wait for anyone to come to my rescue. If they weren't going to see me, I would make them. The plan started forming in my head. The pieces clicked together like a puzzle I hadn't realized I had been solving all along. I needed to expose the truth, not just to them, but to myself. The truth about how they treated me, how I allowed it for so long, and how I had finally reached the point where I could not, and would not, accept it any longer. I began by making a list, something tangible, something tactical. I wrote down the key players: my mother, my siblings, my colleagues. Each person had played a role in my silence, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and each of them would be held accountable in a way that I had never done before. But I had learned the hard way that revenge wasn't just about emotion. It had to be calculated. It had to be precise, clean. If I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, I needed to create a situation where they would have no choice but to acknowledge my pain, my existence, my power. This wasn't about destruction. It was about reclamation. I thought about the dinner parties, the charity events where I had always been the invisible one, the one who was there but never truly seen. I would use those same settings to my advantage. A charity event would be my stage, a perfect place to confront them, to show them who I really was. I could already picture it, an elegant, carefully orchestrated evening, all the guests around, all eyes on me, and I would take the stage. Not with a speech, but with an action. I would use the connections I had, the networks that I had been part of but had never truly belonged to. It was time for me to belong. The event was set. The plans were in motion. I wasn't just going to show up. I was going to own the night. But it wasn't just about the event or the confrontation. The deeper I went into this plan, the clearer it became. This was about me taking back control over my own story. I had to confront my pain, my scars, not just for them, but for me. I wasn't doing this for revenge alone. I was doing it to heal. As I finalized my plans, a part of me hesitated. What would it feel like after I executed this plan? Would I finally feel satisfied, or would it leave a hollow emptiness inside of me? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that no matter the outcome, I had already won by taking action. I had stepped into my own power. But still, as I stood there, staring at the list I had made, the uncertainty gnawed at me. What if this only made things worse? What if my calculated move only spiraled into more hurt, more pain? The night of the charity event arrived with a chill in the air, the kind that seemed to creep into your bones. A reminder of the emotional coldness I had been carrying for years. The event was set in a grand ballroom, the kind of place where the wealthy mingled, exchanging smiles and business cards, pretending to care about causes they barely understood. It was the perfect stage for me to confront everything, to show my family and colleagues who I had become. As I walked into the room, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, but it all felt muffled, like I was moving through a fog. The bright lights above illuminated the faces of the people who had always overlooked me, and tonight, I was going to make them see. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the invisible girl standing in the corner. Tonight, I was going to stand in the spotlight and demand the respect I had never received. The room was filled with familiar faces. My mother, elegantly dressed in a gown that shimmered like the stars above, was busy chatting with some of her friends. My siblings were there too, exchanging pleasantries with the kind of ease I had never understood. It wasn't just the rich and the famous who came to these events, it was the people who had shaped my life. The ones who had treated me like I was nothing more than an accessory in their world. I felt my heartbeat quicken, but there was no turning back now. The plan was set, and it was too late to stop it. The waiters glided past me, their trays full of hors d'oeuvres and champagne, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on my mother, who was laughing too loudly at something one of her friends said, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I took a deep breath and made my way to the stage. It wasn't just about confronting them. It was about claiming my space, about telling them I was no longer willing to be treated like an afterthought in my own life. The microphone felt heavier in my hand than I had anticipated, and as I stepped into the spotlight, the room fell into an almost surreal silence. All eyes turned to me, and for the first time, I wasn't invisible. I was seen. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steady, though my heart felt like it was racing out of my chest. "Thank you all for coming tonight to support such an important cause." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle before continuing. "But tonight, I'm not here to talk about charity. I'm here to talk about something far more personal, something I've been forced to endure in silence for far too long." The room shifted, the whispers began, soft and quick, as people exchanged confused glances. But I wasn't stopping now. I could feel their eyes on me, and I wasn't afraid. "For years," I continued, my voice gaining strength, "I've stood on the sidelines of my own life, watching as those who should have loved me instead chose to ignore my pain. They've betrayed me in ways that I can no longer keep silent about." I glanced at my mother, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her eye, surprise, maybe even a bit of guilt. But it wasn't enough. She hadn't seen me when I was suffering, and now, I was showing her just how much of me she had missed. I moved to the center of the stage, allowing the spotlight to wash over me, my voice carrying through the room. "I am done being the good daughter, the invisible one. I'm done pretending that my pain doesn't matter. I am here to take back what is mine, my voice, my story, and my worth. If you cannot see me, if you cannot respect me for who I am, then I no longer need you in my life." The room was silent. I could feel the weight of the moment in my chest, the release of all the years of repressed anger, frustration, and pain. The people who had used me, belittled me, and treated me like a shadow were now forced to look at me, to hear me, and then, the real confrontation happened. My mother stood up, her face turning red with anger. "What is this, Layla?" she snapped. "You're making a scene in front of all these people. This is not how we behave in this family." But I didn't flinch. I stood tall, feeling the power in my words. "This is exactly how we behave. This is how I've been forced to live, quietly suffering, pretending that everything was fine. But I am not your little puppet anymore. I will not hide. I will not be small." The tension in the room was palpable. My siblings shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some of the guests were whispering to each other, but I didn't care. This wasn't for them, it was for me. "You don't get it, do you?" I continued, my voice cutting through the silence. "I've been invisible for so long that I started to believe it too, but I am done with that. I am done being the afterthought in your lives." I turned toward the back of the room, where some of the more influential guests were watching. They were the ones who had always seen me as just another face in the crowd, another person to be used for their own gain. But tonight, that would change. I'm here to show you that I matter. That I've always mattered. And if you can't see that, if you can't respect it, then I will find my worth elsewhere. There was no turning back now. The plan had worked. The shock, the confrontation, the release. I had said the words that had been burning inside of me for years. I had exposed the truth, not for them, but for myself. The silence in the room was deafening, but deep down, I felt something I had never felt before: empowerment. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to define me. I was defining myself. The charity event was supposed to be a celebration, a moment where the wealthy mingled and the elite danced around their carefully constructed facades, pretending that everything was perfect. But for me, it became the beginning of something else entirely. The confrontation. The speech I had unleashed a storm that I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. As the night dragged on, I found myself standing in the back of the ballroom, the noise of clinking glasses and murmured conversations fading into the background. My heart was still racing, my body vibrating with adrenaline. The people around me had resumed their small talk, their casual mingling, but I couldn't shake the weight of the moment. I had spoken my truth, but in doing so, I had exposed myself in ways I hadn't anticipated. I glanced around, searching for my mother, but she had disappeared into the crowd, her face flushed with anger. My siblings were nowhere to be found either, likely avoiding the tension I had created. I felt a pang of loneliness, a raw, vulnerable feeling I wasn't used to. In that moment, I realized that I had expected something more. I had hoped for recognition, a moment of validation from the people who had hurt me the most. But instead, I had been met with indifference. What was supposed to be a declaration of my worth had, in some ways, backfired. No one seemed to care. No one stepped forward to acknowledge the pain I had so publicly revealed. My mother had been angry, my siblings silent. I stood there, surrounded by all the people I had fought so hard to make notice me, and yet I felt invisible all over again. I was consumed by doubt. Had it been worth it? Did they even care? Had I exposed myself only to be met with coldness and disregard? For a brief moment, I considered running away, escaping this uncomfortable feeling, retreating back to the shadows I had been fighting to leave behind. I stepped outside the ballroom, needing space, needing air. The cold night wrapped around me like a blanket, but it was the kind of cold that didn't numb you. It made everything sharper. The chill hit my skin, biting through my dress, but I barely noticed. My thoughts were swirling, each one heavier than the last. That was when I saw him. Jasper, my bodyguard, was standing a few feet away, his silhouette stark against the dim streetlights. He was there, watching me, waiting. It had been months since he had been assigned to me, but I'd hardly seen him outside of his professional capacity. I had always kept him at arm's length. The bodyguard was just that. Nothing more, but tonight, something about his presence felt different. He stepped forward, his usual stoic expression softening as he approached. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice quiet, concerned. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to ask that. How much I needed someone to care. "I'm fine," I lied, wiping my face as if I could erase the emotions that had bubbled to the surface. Just needed a moment." He didn't press. He stood there, silently, allowing the quiet to stretch between us. After a beat, he spoke again. "That was a brave thing you did back there. But I've seen you face far worse than that." I chuckled bitterly, a hollow sound that barely resembled laughter. "Brave? I felt like I was invisible, Jasper. I thought they would finally see me, but instead, I've just made everything worse." Jasper stepped closer, his expression unchanged, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, something that made my chest tighten. "You've been carrying this for a long time, Layla, but you're not invisible anymore. Not to me. And not to anyone who matters." His words hung in the air like a lifeline. For the first time that night, I let my guard down. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that I was worthy of someone else's concern. "You really think they'll ever see me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a vulnerability I hadn't shown in years. "I think they already have," Jasper replied quietly, taking a step closer, his eyes soft but unwavering. "It's just that you're looking for validation in the wrong places. You've got to stop trying to earn their love, their respect. You already have it. From those who really matter. From me." His words hit me harder than I expected. Jasper wasn't just a bodyguard. He wasn't just someone paid to stand by my side. There was a genuine care in his voice, in the way he looked at me, and in that moment, I realized something I had been too blind to see before. For so long, I had been chasing the love and approval of people who couldn't give it to me. I had been waiting for my family to validate me, to make me feel seen, but they had never done so. Not because they couldn't, but because they hadn't chosen to. The truth was, I had been looking for love in the wrong places, and it had only left me feeling emptier each time, and then I realized I didn't need them. I didn't need to chase their approval, to constantly fight for my place in their world. I had fought for myself. I had found my voice, and that was enough. Jasper had seen me. He had recognized me for who I was, and for the first time, that was enough. I turned to him, feeling something shift inside me, something lighter. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you tonight." Jasper's face softened as he reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder in a simple gesture of comfort. "You don't have to thank me. You've already done the hard part. You've shown them who you are." In that moment, I understood. The satisfaction wasn't in the revenge, in the confrontation, or in the response from my family. The satisfaction was in me, in standing up, in claiming my space, in finally letting go of the need for validation from the people who would never give it to me. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in my life, I was ready to walk it on my own.